Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I know I have been gone for a while, right? I was on vacation in Mexico. I had a wonderful time. And then I got back, and I swear to you, I've had the missing my vacation blues. Just feeling like, I want to still be on my vacation and I want to be in the sunshine. I want to be swimming by the pool and whatnot. But nonetheless, I'm back and back to work. And these last couple of days, really just watching what has been unfolding in Israel and Palestine and the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and wanting to break down for you guys what is really going on over in that area, in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and giving you guys a real accurate and true perspective of the truth of really what's happening over there. There is a lot of misinformation, and I'm seeing a lot of misinformation coming from both sides about what is happening over there and also what started it. There's misinformation as to what started it. A lot of people think that it has to do with evictions from a neighborhood. That is not entirely accurate. There's also some information out there. We've seen videos circulating on social media, a woman in particular yelling at a man saying that he's stealing her house. And that has been widely circulated. There's also been videos, many other videos widely circulating, causing a lot of outrage. And much of the outrage is rightful. And so tonight, what I want to do is really break down the truth. What are we really looking at? What is the situation from both perspectives? And then really, where do we go from here? This conflict has been going on for quite some time. And really, truly, I think the root of the majority of the conflicts going on in the Middle East has to do with this one conflict. It boils down to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Practically every other conflict in the Middle East boils down to this one. And so it is extremely important to understand. It is also extremely important that we are knowing the truth from both perspectives. It's extremely important that we then advocate for something that is healthy for both sides in that area, because one side is not going to go away. And as much as some people think, well, one side could go and everything will be fine, depending on which side you're on, that is not realistic. And so we're going to break all of this down tonight. So I want to start off with just showing you some of the images of what we're seeing a lot in the media, and kind of showing you guys what the reality is of those. Now, I have been in contact with the friends I have made in Palestine and also some of my Israeli Jewish friends to kind of get both perspectives on what is going on. And many of you know, I did go and take a trip to the West Bank. I went and saw the occupation for myself firsthand about a year and a half ago. And so it was October of 2019. Right before the pandemic. And so I have a perspective of what it looks like over there, what the occupation looks like, some of the sentiment of the Palestinians, and what they want and what could happen potentially moving forward. So just wanted to kind of lay all that out there, and let's go ahead and try to break this down. So first of all, we have been seeing some of the images on the news, and I've been watching CNN, MSNBC. I've been watching Fox. Fox is very hardline right-wing right on this stuff. They're like, oh, these terrorists are coming after Israel, and they're just on Israel's side 100%. They're not even attempting to share the other side of the story with the Palestinians and what is going on. We're also seeing Joe Biden, the Biden administration, Nancy Pelosi. We're seeing all of them come out in favor of Israel, right? They're saying we stand with Israel. Joe Biden is under fire from the likes of the Squad, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, which, this is one of the times I love the Squad, when they lay out the truth and the facts and kind of call the Democratic Party to the carpet. Joe Biden, just so everybody is understanding why Joe Biden is taking the side of Israel and not even kind of trying to both sides it, right? He's just saying, no, Hamas needs to stop the terrorism. Joe Biden has taken more money than any other senator in the history of the U.S. Senate from pro-Israel lobby by $1.5 million. Okay, the second most The second senator who took the most from the Israeli lobby is Hillary Clinton. And this includes Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so Republicans don't even make the list until fourth or fifth on the list of who has taken the most from the pro-Israel lobby. But just so everybody understands, the person who has taken the absolute most money from in the U.S. Senate from the pro-Israel lobby is Joe Biden. More than any Democrat, more than any Republican. So you're not going to get from Joe Biden any sort of real, anything that's going to be fair, right? He is bought off, and he is going to maintain and behave like he's bought off. And so will the rest of the Democratic Party, and so will much of the Republican Party. So that is the big issue the Palestinians face, is that the U.S. government is bought off by the lobby, and none of them, it was very smart of the lobby to buy off both sides, and none of them are willing to, ruffle the feathers of the pro-Israel lobby. That's where they get a lot of money. Joe Biden took, I believe, $3.5 million from the pro-Israel lobby over the years, and Hillary Clinton took $1.5 million less than that. She's number 2 on the list. So just to kind of give you guys a perspective. So here are some of the rockets we're seeing on the news. This one is from Gaza coming into Israel. You see these rockets flying in. It's quite the show. And this is what the Israelis are pointing at and saying, look, we are under attack. These are terrorists. Hamas is coming after us. We are just Israelis trying to live in peace, and they do this to us. And that is true. This is horrifying. If you were living anywhere in Israel and this happened, you would be absolutely horrified that there was a chance that a rocket could hit your house and could kill you. And it has. There have been casualties on the Israeli side. So that is horrifying. It's not helping, right, for Hamas to be lobbing rockets into Israel. We're also seeing, we also saw, let's see what else I can show you before we kind of break down some of the truth stuff. Let's see here. So here was a raid on Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I'll detail, I did get requests from people to break this down for dummies, for people who know absolutely nothing. So I am going to do that. I just want to show you some of the stuff. So this is a raid, because I want to show you first what we're kind of seeing in the news and on social media. This is the raid of Al-Aqsa Mosque. These are the soldiers, the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, storming into the mosque and lobbing, a variety of different types of weapons, smoke bombs and sound bombs and things like that into the mosque. Now, this mosque in Jerusalem is it's the third holiest site in all of Islam for the religion. It's a very, very holy place. You are not to wear your shoes inside of these mosques. It's absolutely forbidden. And when these soldiers storm in and they wear their shoes, obviously, plus they're throwing all of these various different types of weapons into the mosque, the whole thing has to be cleaned and re-blessed or whatever it is that they have to do in order to make it appropriate again for prayer. And this happens not maybe to this exact extent, but the soldiers often raid the Al-Aqsa Mosque, causing the people to have to sanitize and re-bless and whatever the mosque to prepare it again for prayer. But obviously this is very egregious. This is during Ramadan. This is their most holy time of year in one of their holiest sites. And to have the soldiers raid in while people are praying is, it's not great, right? So I wanted to show you another video. This one is particularly terrifying. This is an IDF soldier, and he's going to kick this man who's in prayer, who, is obviously doing nothing, and this soldier comes and kicks him, trying to get him out of the way. He doesn't want him praying in the middle of the road there, so he decides to kick him out of there so that they can, they're trying to, very aggressive way to clear the person from the area, right? While they then obviously are trying to stop something that's going on over here. But, nonetheless, right? So this is all very This is also an image of, let me show you this image. This is the rocket fire. So Gaza has lobbed missiles or rockets into Israel, and Israel has lobbed missiles into Gaza. And here is what the damage is in Gaza. Now, we've had many, 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 many more deaths on the Palestinian side of this conflict than on the Israeli side. And that's pretty typical. The stats, I believe, are 1 in 30. It's 1 in 10 or 1 in 30. It's pretty high. But every time one Israeli is killed, the Israelis go and kill like 30 Palestinians in response. So it's not an appropriate, it's not an even response. It's not an appropriate response. And that's what happens. So we're seeing numerous deaths in Gaza, including children and men and women, and it's atrocious, right? So that is what's going on there. So now that I've kind of shown you what we're seeing, and we've also seen a couple of other things. This was another one, and I'm going to break down the truth of a couple of these videos. This is another one that we also saw circulating on social media. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It looks like it's burning in the background. And then we're seeing all of these Israeli youth here. Why is it not? And they're, dancing. Okay, they're dancing, they're cheering, they're singing. Some of them could be heard saying things like, kind of like, get rid of all the Arabs. But that's not what they're singing. There's been on social media people saying that they were singing to eradicate Arabs or something. And that is not what they were singing. They were singing something they always sing. It's like a pretty typical thing. And they're not actually dancing and cheering about the fire going on in the background. They were dancing and cheering well before the fire started. And the song they were singing is it's like a biblical song. But some of them could be heard saying, cheering and saying things about getting rid of Arabs. And there's also this video here. Let me show this one to you. This is one that really sparked a lot of scrutiny online. And this is a man who's saying that he's a woman who's accusing this man of stealing her home. A Palestinian woman accusing a Jewish man of stealing her home. And this is the video. You might have seen this, but if not, here it is.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
Okay, so we see there, she says, you're stealing my house. You're stealing my house. And he says, if I don't steal it, somebody else will. So all of this has been very inflaming, and you might have seen all of this circulating on social media and in the news. So now let's try to understand exactly what's going on. So part of the narrative that's happened is that this is over a group of families being evicted from an area in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, called Sheikh Jarrah. And that is something that is happening, and that is something that is definitely inflaming the situation. But that is not why this started. The reason this started was when the Israeli forces, for no real reason, decided to block off Damascus Gate, which is an important area for the Muslims. After they pray during Ramadan, they like to go and they like to hang out at Damascus Gate. So here is an image for you. Let me see, where did it go here? Let me show you an image of Damascus Gate and the people there. What they typically do every single year is they typically do this, they gather here at Damascus Gate. This is a gate into the old city of Jerusalem. When you go through this gate, you end up inside of the old city and on the Arab side of town. Okay. So they always gather here after fasting. They get together, and this is a real popular place for people to gather after Ramadan. And for whatever reason, not really with any real explanation, and this is part of the problem, the Israelis decided to close off Damascus Gate for Ramadan. And that obviously really upset the Palestinian people. They were like, why? And the Israelis didn't really have a whole good answer. They just always say, and it's always the same excuse all the time, no matter what they do, they always say for security reasons, for security. And they don't give any reason why the security is extra, why they have to block off certain routes, roads, areas, why they block off checkpoints. Why do they do all of these things? They never give a reason. They always just say for security reasons. So this is obviously extremely upsetting to the people because they're never given any clear reason as to why their lives are disrupted. And it's just oppressive. It feels oppressive. It feels like, oh, if you're not going to give me a really good reason why you're doing something, then I just think you're doing it just to upset me. And that's probably accurate. They're probably doing it just to upset them. And so, you know, but they claim, no, we're doing it because there's these terrorists and they rise up and there's riots and there's these things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, they're not giving them any real reason. So Damascus Gate being closed off is actually why the conflict started. And then on top of that, people started getting word of other things that were going on that were upsetting to the Palestinians who were already feeling upset because their lives are constantly disrupted. And the one time they don't want their life disrupted is during Ramadan. They want to be able to get together. They want to be able to pray. They want to be able to gather. And that is what they want to do. Now, there's nothing about COVID regarding this, like why they closed it down, why people can't gather, has nothing to do with COVID in Israel. Israel is completely back to normal. They have all their gatherings. They're not wearing masks. Remember that they vaccinated the vast majority of their adult population. And because of that, they have seen very, very little spread. I think they're down to nothing. And so they have just opened up and they're totally back to normal. So this has nothing to do with COVID. They might have used that as a bit of an excuse at first, but nonetheless, the Palestinians were saying, what the heck? Why are you closing down our spot during Ramadan? You're just doing this to antagonize us. And then the whole conflict with Sheikh Jarrah came into play. So now this is a really interesting dispute. And if you really hear both sides of the story, it kind of helps you understand why this is so complex. And it's important you understand both sides of the story so that you can then form an opinion as to what should happen going forward. So Sheikh Jarrah is an area of Jerusalem that is inhabited by primarily Palestinians at this point. And back in the 1800s, before Israel was a nation, a group of Jews bought this land. They bought it in like 1875, and really very few Jews were living on it at the time. It was a small kind of community enclave. And they say the reason why they bought it is because it's a holy site, and Jews have always lived on this site for thousands of years. And it's theirs, right? And that's kind of the entire story of Israel, right? They say, hey, we've been here for thousands of years. It's all ours. Like this was ours thousands of years ago. And so now it should be ours again today. And that is kind of what they said about this neighborhood that is called Sheikh Jarrah. Well, after the war in 1948, when the British Mandate created the state of Israel, regardless of all the other Arab people living there, suddenly the British said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and give the Jews a nation of their own. And they went ahead and they said, Israel is now a nation. And obviously this upset the people who were already living there. And they were saying, what? What do you mean? You're going to give this land away to these people? What the heck? You know, if you're going to give it to anybody, you should give it to us because we live here. And so the people that were living there were pretty upset, and a war broke out. And this war included other countries. The Arab nations got together and they fought Israel in attempts to stop this British mandate of this creation of a Jewish nation. They lost. So because they lost, a lot of the Arabs were then evicted from their homes in 1948. They were evicted from the areas that would now be like Tel Aviv, you know, all of the areas that are really well within Israel. And these Palestinian people, thousands and thousands and thousands of them were shoved towards the West Bank. And, you know, they were moved east. So as they moved, they needed a place to live. They had lost their homes in the war. They had lost their businesses in the war. They had lost everything they owned. And many of them were refugees, essentially, in their own country. They didn't know where to go. They were shacking up with friends and people they might have known. And then organizations came in, and organizations would set up tent communities to try to give them some shelter until they could figure out what to do. And so in the 50s, the Jordanian government and the UNRWA, I think I might have gotten the acronyms a little bit wrong, but they got together and a bunch of money, and they decided to section off this area. They took this area of land and they started building homes for these Palestinian people who were relegated to this area. The area of Sheikh Jarrah, even though in 1975 it was bought by a couple of Jewish organizations, by the time the 1948 war happened, Jordan was able to at least maintain this area of East Jerusalem. So it was under Jordanian control. So the Jordanians owned the land at that point. That was part of the war. That was part of the treaty. They were able to maintain that land. So they took that land and they built homes for these Palestinians. This was in the 50s. So Palestinian families have been living in these homes that were built for them by these organizations that were helping them rebuild their lives after war since the 50s. Well, then the war broke out in 1967. And in 1967, so this is, 15 years after these families have been living in these homes, in the war of 1967, Israel then captured the entirety of Jerusalem. And they captured it. And so they said, now it's ours. And then there was, of course, this discussion, well, you can't get rid of all these people. And they're, okay, fine, they can stay. But they're going to stay, and they're now just tenants of land we own. They are no longer owning this land. They never owned the land. This was the viewpoint from the Jewish people was Jewish groups bought this in 1875. Never mind the fact Jordan had actually taken control of the land and it was technically under Jordanian control. They said it doesn't matter. We're reverting back to the way it was in 1975. We own that land. These Palestinians are illegally occupying it now. We'll make it legal. They went ahead and they went to a court and they said, we'll make it legal. We'll make them tenants, but they're not owners of this land. So they went to court and they established this in the 50s. And the Palestinians signed this agreement, but they signed it under duress. And that is what they're saying, and probably is pretty true. They signed it in the 70s. I'm sorry. They went to court in the 70s. They received the land in the 50s. They had lived in the land in houses that were built from them by the Jordanian government for 20 years. And then 20 years later, they had to go to court, and under duress, these Israelis who won in an Israeli court, they won, they took the case to an Israeli court, and the Israeli court granted the Israelis the land and said, yes, you're the rightful owner because we can trace a land deed back to 1875. So they told these Palestinians, you are now just tenants and you have to pay rent. And so the Palestinians signed the agreement. They had no other choice. These were their homes. They'd lived in these homes. They were built for them by Jordanian government and by an organization, a humanitarian organization. And now, in order for them to stay in these homes that were built for them, they would have to become tenants of these houses. So they signed these agreements under duress. That is their claim. So since the 70s, various attempts in courts have attempted to remove these Palestinians from these homes inside of this neighborhood that was built for them by Jordan on land that was originally bought by Jews in 1875. Are you following? So now you fast forward, and there have been numerous, there have been international groups coming around condemning their attempt to reclaim and evict these Palestinians. And so obviously now we fast forward to today, and these court battles are still raging on all of these years later. And now you can imagine these Palestinians families have been living in these homes since the 50s. And it's now 2021. They've been living in these homes for 70 years. 70 years. The people that are there are now born to those homes. And now they're being told that they're going to court again, and the court is likely to rule in favor of the Israelis. The Israeli court is going to favor and rule in favor of the Israelis, which is, I don't think, a surprise, right? So this word got out that these families are going to be evicted. Now, the Israeli viewpoint is they're tenants. They failed to pay rent, or, well, they're not saying they failed to pay rent, but what they're saying, so maybe some of them might be behind on rent. I don't know, COVID, right? But they might say that, well, their lease is up We terminated their lease. It's up now. And now they have to go. They're not allowed to stay any longer. It's our land. So to them, it's a land dispute. The dispute is these people are illegally there. It was land bought by these Jewish organizations in 1875, and it belongs to us. And the courts of law have granted us ownership of this land. And the courts of law have said you needed to vacate. Your lease was up, and it's time for you to go. And so you've got to get off this land. It's legally ours. That is the Israeli viewpoint. The Palestinian viewpoint is this land was Jordanian land given to us, and homes were built for us on this land by the Jordanian government. You have annexed all of Jerusalem. You're not supposed to do that. That's against international law. You're not supposed to be annexing East Jerusalem. That is supposed to belong to the Palestinian state. They're supposed to divide Jerusalem, right? So the Palestinians would get half of it, the Israelis would get the other half, and it would be a capital city for both countries, in effect. And so the Palestinians say, you have stolen Jerusalem, the whole of Jerusalem, and you weren't supposed to do that. You're now occupying it. You're attempting to occupy it further by bringing in your own population, which is against conventions, international conventions of war, rules of engagement, rules of war. It's against that. You're not supposed to bring in, the occupier is not supposed to bring in then their own residents to reoccupy and colonize the region. And so this eviction is totally and completely illegal by international standards. That is the Palestinian viewpoint. So that land dispute has now infiltrated much of the narrative, especially in the West, I would say more so than even what's gone on inside of the conflict there on the ground. They're more upset about everything, right? So this is a boiling over of all of the attempts like this. So this brings me to the video of the woman who says, Jacob, you're stealing my house. And he says, if I don't steal it, somebody else will. So it's when we think of theft, right, we have a tendency to think somebody actually comes in and steals it and they're just taking it and nobody does anything about it, right? And it's not quite like that. Okay, what happens is these Israelis go to court and they go into Israeli courts and the Israeli courts rule in their favor. But it is kind of a rigged system, right? So if you're Palestinian and you're going up against an Israeli and the Israeli has the entire establishment on their side, you're not likely to win. Sometimes the Palestinians do, but more often than not, they don't. The system is not in their favor. It's completely rigged against them. So this guy legally was able to gain the land through legal means, but it is a form of theft using the legal system. So that is the viewpoint so the Palestinians boil it down to theft. They say it's theft. You've just stolen my house. You've stolen my land. And another thing that's an aspect of this to keep in mind with the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood is that in the 50s, I believe it was, in the 70s, right when, so they built these homes in this neighborhood in the 50s. These people have been living it in 20 years. The War of 1967, the Israelis had captured all of Jerusalem. And in the 70s, Israel made a law. And this is what I mean by the rigged system. Israel made a law saying that any Jewish Israeli and only Jewish Israelis, so they did not give this right to Palestinians. They did not give this right to Arab Israelis. They gave this right only to Jewish Israelis. They would have the right to return, essentially. They would be able to gain access to any property they owned prior to the wars, so as long as they could provide a deed. So if they could come up with a deed, then they could own that house. They could own that land, and only they would have the right to do this. They did not give the Palestinians the same right. So Palestinians are looking at homes like that are now modern day Tel Aviv, for example, and they're saying, well, that was my land and I've got a deed to it. And the Israelis say, yeah, tough luck. That's not the law. However, an Israeli Jew, and only a Jewish Israeli, can go into Jerusalem, for example, and say, back in 1875, this was our land. We don't care if Jordan took it. We don't care if Jordan built you a house and gave you the land. It was mine, and therefore the law says I get to have this back. So this is what I mean by the rigged system, right? It's a system. It's a law. Yes, a rational, intelligent person could look at it and say, well, the law is the law. I guess they're right. I mean, they do have a deed from 1875, and the law says that they're allowed to reclaim their land as long as they can provide a deed. So tough luck, right? But it's a rigged system, and you could see how that feels very rigged. And that is kind of daily life for Palestinians all the time. That is sort of what they're facing nonstop. So this is the life of the Palestinians. They're fighting a system that is built against them by people who don't really want them there anymore, who believe that all of it is theirs and they want to take it back. And so they're up against this behemoth. There is no way to fight back. And then on top of it, the Israelis have the muscle of the Americans, right? And the Israelis have the backing of Germany and the backing of Europe and the backing of everybody. And the Palestinians have really kind of nothing. They've got some Arab nations and that's about it. But other than that, they're not, they did find some friends in Iran. They've got some muscle, but other than that, they're really up against a brick wall. So, that has escalated the situation. And that is the truth of and why when you talk to Jewish Americans who maybe are very pro-Israel, or you might even talk to dual citizens, or you might talk to Israelis, they always say it's complicated, right? It's complicated. It's more complicated. And that's the answer you always get from them. And they're not wrong. It is complicated when you actually start to break it down. But at the end of the day, it's not really that complicated. What has happened is a group of people have shown up on the shore and said, we want this all back. It was ours 2,000 years ago, and we're back, and we want it back. And so you're not supposed to be here. We were here first 2,000 years ago. And then you guys showed up, and you guys showed up from these other Arab countries, and there's no such thing as Palestine. And so they say there's no such thing as Palestinian people, and there's no such thing as Palestine, and you guys are all just a bunch of other Arabs, and you guys have all migrated over here, and you've migrated onto our land, and it's ours, and you need to go. And that is kind of the attitude of most of the Zionists. And I want to make something clear. There is a difference between an Israeli, a Jew, and a Zionist. And people kind of think that they're all one and the same, and they tend to use those terms very derogatory. And that's not, an Israeli is not always a Zionist, and a Zionist is not always an Israeli. And a Jew is not always a Zionist, nor is a Jew always an Israeli, and an Israeli is not always a Jew, okay? So it's like there are three different things. You have Israelis. That is a country. It's a citizenship. You have Israelis that are Arab and they're Muslim. They're not Jewish at all. So you have Israelis that are not Jewish. So being anti-Israel is not actually anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Jewish. It's just saying this country, there are people who believe this country shouldn't even exist, that, whatever their thinking is, it's not actually anti-Semitic to be anti-Israel. It's also not anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionism. Zionism has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. It's not in the Jewish religion at all. Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people deserve their own country. That is actually quite a prevalent feeling inside of Christianity. So there are a ton of Christian American Zionists, and they qualify as Zionists by every definition of the term. They fund Israel, they fund the Zionist movement, and they are very much Zionists themselves. And so that Zionism is independent of the religion. And actually, if anything, it's more inside the Christian religion than it is inside of Judaism. I think actually in Judaism, the idea of Zionism is totally against God in Judaism. And the most religious Jews inside of Israel are against the creation of the Jewish nation. They believe that they'll ultimately be punished, that they will ultimately have history repeat itself again, that they will be once again driven out or eradicated or persecuted of some kind. Like whenever they rise up and they try to gain power in this way, the real religious Jews, the real, I believe it's the real Orthodox, they believe that that this rising up of a Jewish nation will only lead to doom for the Jewish people. And they might not be wrong on that, as we've seen the sentiments change inside of the minds of people. Now that we have social media, I mean, it was one thing to believe everything that the mainstream media and our politicians would tell us back in 2000 or even 2005 or even 2010, before there was really this explosion of social media. But now that you've got this social media and people can share videos and people can upload, and they use TikTok and they use Instagram and they use Facebook and YouTube and all of these. And even though the Palestinians are only given 3G, they're not given anything faster than 3G by the Israeli government. The Israelis control the airspace. And so they have only at this point authorized for 3G in Palestine, and that's for a reason. One of the reasons is to limit the amount of live streaming, limit the amount of uploading they're able to do of what is happening there. It's a way to keep them kind of suppressed. So, and to keep the information from getting out there. And I think before all of this was out there, it was easy to just kind of gobble up what the mainstream and the politicians told us. But now with social media, it's a lot harder to close our eyes. It's a lot harder to say, yeah, you're right, it's complicated, as this Israeli soldier is kicking a guy in prayer. It's a lot harder to say, yeah, it's complicated, as we see these families being driven from their homes because some person who was not alive in 1875 comes back around and says, yeah, but I got a deed from 1875 and I don't care if you've been here for 70 years, you're out. Everybody can feel in their core that that is wrong. Okay, even if it might be legal, it is morally and ethically wrong. And we all feel that. We all know that. We all can sit there and say clearly. And so, when we see these things and we see the mosque raided and we see these things, it creates an understanding amongst the people that this is not a one-sided conflict. The narrative that we had been told all of our lives was that the Palestinians were a bunch of terrorists, that they were throwing rocks and rockets and Molotov cocktails and all of these things and blowing up buses and doing all of these crazy things against the Israelis, and that they were just a bunch of terrorists. And now, with the rise of social media, and now with more and more people like myself going over there and seeing the occupation firsthand, the narrative is shifting. And we're seeing this shift happen. We're seeing it happen inside the Democratic Party. We're seeing it happen even in the Republican voting base. Now, Fox News and, you've got, of course, the Ben Shapiro's of the world. They are still, obviously, Ben Shapiro is very pro-Israel. He's very much a Zionist. And so you've got all these these more, well, actually, I don't know if I would think he is, right? Because he does advocate for the creation of a Jewish nation. So it's one thing, though, to advocate. But I should take that back. I don't know if he's a Zionist, because that is very specific. That is somebody who really not only advocates, but their goal is this Jewish nation. It's one thing to support the nation now that it's there. That doesn't make you a Zionist either. If you say Israel has the right to exist, if you say I support Israel, that doesn't make you a Zionist. A Zionist is somebody who is really, truly wanting, they believe in this movement of this creation of a Jewish nation. And many Zionists, their ultimate vision is a Jewish nation that takes quite a bit of land. They think, let's see if I can find you a map of what the real Zionists want to see. Let me see if I can find for you. Their project is here's a good map here. Let's see if I can. They really would like to expand even larger. You can see here that this right here, this red area, is the ultimate goal of the real Zionist movement that really wants to create a big Jewish nation, and they believe it should look like this. So that takes up a lot of Egypt, a chunk of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, mostly Syria, all of Lebanon, a little bit of Turkey, and you've got also Iraq, a big chunk of Iraq. This is also why, just so you guys can understand, why the Israelis support the Kurdish separatist movement. So you know that there are the Kurds that have been trying to gain, this land right up here in the border of Turkey and Syria. You also have Kurds in Iraq. You have a Kurdish zone in Iraq. And obviously we're seeing a lot of the unrest in Syria. And a lot of the reason why the Israelis back this Kurdish separatism is because they want to cut that area off and make it independent and then absorb it. It'll be a lot easier for them to absorb it when it's Kurdish people living there than it is if it's, Turkey's land, technical borders, or if it's Iraq's technical border, right? It'll be a lot easier if it's a separate Kurdish nation. So this is like the ultimate goal of the Zionists, is that they want to see this huge area created of Israel. So it won't stop with the Palestinians. So anybody that thinks that this ideology is going to stop with the Palestinians, it isn't. The idea is that this continues on and on and on until it captures all of this land. And that is just the reality of it. And when you're over there, they're not shy about it. Here in America, I feel like there's a little bit of if you say this, then you're anti-Semitic. But over there, they're pretty flagrant about it. I mean, quite a few of them are like, yeah, this is what we want. And they even have maps of this and they're like parading it around. And they're like, yeah, we want this, this is Israel. This is what the belief is that it should go from, this whole landmass. Look, because they have this idea to create this giant nation, the Zionists who have a lot of power in the Israeli government, they do whatever they can to make the Palestinians' lives difficult, because they ultimately would like them to go. They would like them to find a new home. Because at some point, a lot of Palestinians, and this is true, this has happened. Many of the Palestinians are here in America. Many Palestinians are in Jordan. Many Palestinians are all around the world. And they've left. They've said this is too hard. And they leave. And that is the ultimate goal of many of the people on the more radical right of Israel. Now, there's a big chunk of Israel. There's a growing chunk of the Israelis that are saying, no, they're not Zionists, okay? So they don't believe in this. They're like, no way, let's just live in peace. We deserve our own peaceful state. They deserve their own peaceful state, and let's let it be. And that sentiment is growing inside of Israel. So you're seeing a lot more Israelis saying this conflict and this push from the radical right wing of Israel is creating this constant state of fear and terror. And it's causing terror in the lives of Palestinians, and it's terror in the lives of Israelis. And so there's a growing base of Israelis that are pushing back on this. There's a growing base of American Jews who are supportive of the state of Israel, but they're not supportive of the expansion or the idea of a greater Israel. Those people also are speaking up saying, no, we deserve our own nation, and so do the Palestinians, and we need to leave it be with that. So it's important to understand that there is this growing sentiment, and it's important to understand that just because somebody is Jewish, it doesn't mean that they support this. Just because somebody's Israeli, it doesn't mean they support this. But if somebody's a Zionist, they pretty much do. So Zionists are all still, they believe, Christian Zionists are they're very much like, before Jesus Christ can come back for the resurrection, the Jews need to return to the Holy Land and reclaim the Holy Land. And that is part of the book of Revelations. And so that's why we see so many American Christians who tend to be on the Republican Party. That's why we see Fox News being all about this, right? Because they're pandering to their evangelical Christian base. And Mormons believe this pretty heavily too. That's why when you go to Utah, you'll see like the Bank of Zion. You'll hear a lot about Zion. And that's because Mormons are very entrenched in Israel. They've got BYU Israel. So there's this, but it's important to understand that somebody's a Zionist doesn't make them Jewish. Somebody's Jewish doesn't make them a Zionist. Somebody's an Israeli doesn't make them Jewish or a Zionist. It's important to understand all of this. Because anti-Semitism is very real. And I have to say, of all of the negativity that I've ever seen online, the Jewish people do get it the worst. And so, when they say that there's a lot of hate against them and there's a lot of anti-Semitism out there, They're not lying. It is really bad, and we really should stop that. It really needs to end. People need to stop. There's one thing to be against the Zionist movement. There's one thing to be against the occupation of the Palestinians. It's one thing to be against this whole effort to destabilize the Middle East so that they could ultimately capture all of this land. That is one thing, okay? But to be anti-Semitic is another. And that's one thing that we all have to work towards, is kind of when we see anti-Semitism, to work to correct those people. Same thing with the anti-Palestinian rhetoric. I hear it all day on Fox News today when they're calling all these Palestinians terrorists. And they basically have painted all Arab people as terrorists, and it couldn't be further from the truth. So that, is a bit of a breakdown of what is happening over there. So, why there's these uprisings. It really started with the closing of the Damascus Gate for no reason. And this happens all the time. When I was over there in the West Bank, suddenly a checkpoint that you need to get through in order to go where you're wanting to go. And this happens for Palestinians in their daily commute, right? They're getting up, they're going to work, and then they get to the checkpoint and they find out it's closed. And now they're going to be late to work by 2 hours because they have to take some other route. The Palestinians, what they have to do is they usually will get to the checkpoint well before. These guys get up, they get ready for work. They're supposed to be to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and maybe work is only 20 minutes away. Most of us would get out the door 7:30, 7:45, right? We're jetting out the door. Palestinians have to get out the door by 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning to get 20 minutes away for a job that starts at 8, because they don't know that morning if a checkpoint's going to be closed down. And when they get there and a checkpoint's closed down, in order to ensure they're not going to be late for their 8 o'clock work or 8 o'clock class or whatever it is, they have to go through this big ordeal every single day of their lives. And they're given a different identification that allows them in certain areas or not in certain areas. A lot of the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, their family members that don't live in Jerusalem are not allowed to visit them because they don't have the right documentation, because ultimately the life of the Palestinian is made miserable and made very, very difficult in order to get them to give up. In order to get them to give up and go. It's an act of war. It's a type of warfare. So this is a military occupation. One thing that I want to get to before I kind of close this down tonight, and I will go to your questions and chats at the end here. So if you do have questions, things I didn't cover, please be sure to chat them over right now. In the super chat is the way to do it, because there's too many of you in the regular chat. So, I don't know, buy me a cup of coffee and I'll answer your question regarding this conflict and what I saw and what I experienced while over there. But regarding where to go from here. So I don't think this is going to end up in another war. I don't think this conflict, it won't be a war because there won't be any other Arab nations that are going to come to the rescue of the Palestinians this time, like they did in 1948 and in 1967. Will this result in a third intifada? No, probably not. Probably this is just going to end in the next, hopefully, it'll just end, that the tensions will simmer down. But we don't know. Anything could happen, especially these days, after the pandemic, everybody's on edge. Understanding that the Palestinian people are living life under duress, and they are constantly being under worry about whether or not they're going to be forced out of their homes, whether or not their roads are closed to get to work, whether or not they'll even have running water that day. Their lives are so in disarray that it leaves them very much on edge. It would leave anybody on edge to live life that way. So they're living life this way. And so obviously, when you bully somebody and you bully somebody and you bully somebody, they're going to rise up, and they're at times going to have just had it. And the problem is that when they've had it and they start to fight back with what little they've got, they're called terrorists, right? And then people say, well, but they're look at these terrorists. And then they use that as an excuse to kind of raise up public sympathies and to say, oh, we're doing what we have to do. We have to defend Israel. We have the right to defend ourselves because look at what these terrorists are doing to us. And in reality, the Palestinians feel like the Israelis are the terrorists. They showed up and they said, this is now ours. And we've got a deed from 2,000 years ago from our book. Our book tells us that we're supposed to be here. And these Christians back us up. They said we have to be here too in order for Christ to come back. Some guy we don't even, we don't care about. But they said so. So yeah, here we are. And that is deeply antagonizing. And that to them is terrorism, right? These people showed up. And they showed up and they had big friends. And the friends are muscling these Palestinians around and trying to say, well, you don't really exist. You're not a real Palestinian people. Now, by that logic, if we allow this to happen as Americans, then one day, I want everybody to understand this, one day we will not be the world's greatest power on the planet. It looks more and more like China is going to rise up and become that, right? And or maybe there'll be a multi kind of axis powered world, right? Where you've got Russia and you have China and who knows where it will be in 30 years from now. And imagine if the day that the United States is no longer the world power, like, hackers were able to hack into our infrastructure and debilitate us, like what we just saw with the pipeline. And let's say they were able to do that to us and really cripple us as a nation. And suddenly China, let's say China comes along and says, you know what? The land, belongs to the natives. Natives we're going to help them rise back up and take back their land. And so all of you living in Omaha, you don't get to live in Omaha anymore because now the natives are coming in and they're going to control it. And we're going to give them big weapons and we're going to give them a lot of money to build. And they're going to control the water. They're going to control the pipelines. They're going to control everything. We've hacked the systems. We're now controlling everything. And we're legally allowed now because China says so. And they've given us this land. And we're now going to build. And ultimately, by the way, there's no real American people. You guys all came from somewhere else. Kim, you came from Vietnam. Israel, Kim, their producer, he came from Mexico, right? Some of you guys came from Denmark and England. Go back to where you came from. You certainly didn't come from this land. You don't really exist as a people. And so you need to go back to where you came from. The Native Americans are the real and ancestral inhabitants of this land. Those people are really the ones that are going to they belong here, and therefore we're going to help them. And we don't care if you outnumber them. We don't care if you're the majority population. We don't care. It's their land, and it was theirs before, and you're fake people. You came here from all these other places. You need to go back to where you came from. And that's that. And that's the way it's got to be. That doesn't seem like it feels right to any of us, even though I know there seems to be this growing sentiment coming from the left, almost ironically about that, right? They're kind of like, well, we got to give back. They've got these ideas of reparations and right to return. And that's why I think it's all crap. There can never be, I don't believe in a right to return for anyone. I don't care if you're Jewish and you want to come back to Israel, the Holy Land, you think you can reclaim it. I don't care if you're Palestinian and you think you want to go back and take some land from Tel Aviv. I don't care if you're Native American and you want to take back Omaha. I don't care if it's me wanting to go back to Denmark and take my family farm. I don't believe in a right to return for anyone because of this reason. It's way too complicated, and somebody always had the land before that other person. And so the only thing you can do is just move forward from here and try to prevent somebody from taking your land. And of course, there can be some, return of land if it was recent, right? And things of that nature. But otherwise, this is why I don't support a right to return at all, because a right to return leads to these questions. And we've got a lot of, chatter, ironically, coming from the left, even though the left is very much supportive of Palestine, more so, right? But they're also the ones that would almost feels like they'd be the first to stand in line to say, well, you know what, Omaha once belonged to the natives, so we got to give it back because we're a bunch of white supremacist racists over here, so we got to give Omaha back. It's crazy. It's all crazy. And we just cannot go down that road in the world. But what we're seeing in Israel is a modern day colonization. Now, their whole take, when you ask them, they'll say, we won wars. Look, we won 1948. We won in 1967. They're lost. Too bad. We won. And yeah, okay, except no, because we don't do that in any other country in the world. We beat the Germans. Did we go and take Germany? No, we didn't. Did we carve a section of Germany and say, hey, you know what? This now belongs to the Jews because you guys eradicated them and they need to come back. We didn't even do that. We don't do that in war. Excuse me. Some iced tea. We don't do that. So for them, the excuse of, yeah, but we're winning these wars and so therefore the land is ours now doesn't really hold up in modern times and in modern warfare. And ultimately, they are, excuse me, hold on. Something in my lungs. Ultimately, the really ultra-Orthodox Jews that are living in Israel that say this is really a bad idea, like we shouldn't have our own nation, this is against God, we're going to be punished for this. Maybe people should pay attention to that warning a little bit. I mean, I understand. And a lot of the people that I've listened to that are very, defending Israel and the whole situation, they say, look at where Israel is on a map. Look at this, look at Israel on a map. And look, it's surrounded by all these hostile neighbors, right? It's like this little tiny town, the tiny country the size of New Jersey, and it's surrounded by these hostile Arabs who want them all to go away, right? And it's like, look, America will not always be there to defend you. And that sentiment is growing even in the Republican youth. They're kind of like, why do we care? What's going on here? They're not religious. They're not Christian Zionists. They don't like the war in the Middle East. They know Israel kind of provokes a lot of the wars in the Middle East. And so you've got even these growing young Republicans that are like, I don't know, like, you're your own country. Take care of yourself. We need the money for ourselves. You do your thing. We'll do ours. You're on your own. The minute that happens, Israel's in real trouble. And they're in real trouble if they continue to antagonize the Arab population around them, their neighbors, and the people inside of Israel, and in the Palestinians. So if they continue to antagonize, it will become sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy where they say, yeah, but we're under attack. These people are trying to eradicate us. I'm sorry, but if you don't make any friends in the region, and if you are a lone country in the middle of that region, and they all grow to hate you, one day when your big bully American friend doesn't have your back anymore, you're in trouble. And so it's really important for the future of the state of Israel to rise up, the people inside of Israel and Americans who love Israel. If you love Israel, then you have to advocate for the stopping of this expansionist project and the halting of the settlement building in the West Bank and this hostile attempt to make life for Palestinians absolutely miserable. If you love Israel, then you've got to advocate for a peaceful solution, and the expansionist project is not the way to do it. Now, that's not going to solve all the problems. If the Israelis, suddenly turn around and say, okay, we have been this kind of like big aggressive bully taking all the lunch money from the Palestinians this whole time. And so, maybe we should stop, and because they're getting really scrappy, right? And they're real upset, and it's not making us any friends in the lunchroom. They might do that. But now at this point, and this is where Israel has a legitimate point, the Palestinians are pissed, right? Like, they've been abused for decades now, and they have been shoved around for decades, and they're mad. And a lot of them want revenge. And so it is not safe to have a one-state solution. As much as people here in the West say one-state solution, one democratic state solution, it's a disaster. It's not a good idea. They can't intermix. The Palestinians outnumber the Israelis. They have a very different lifestyle over there. The Palestinians are extremely conservative. The Israelis are way more liberal. The Israelis are, Tel Aviv is like an escape for people that are, LGBTQ. That does not exist anywhere else in the Middle East. It is not a good idea to mix these two populations for fear that it will eradicate a lot of the, I would say, like forward-thinking liberal ideas that are inside of the state of Israel. Israel is like very much similar to a Western country, and they are a safe harbor for people that are different and that people that don't fit the conservative mold. And understanding that the Palestinians that are there are very, very conservative, becoming more and more conservative. It didn't used to always be that way, but they're becoming more and more conservative. And mixing is just not a good idea. The Palestinians I spoke to when I was there don't even want it. They don't want to live together. They want their own nation. Now, then people say to me, well, Kim, they can't have their own nation because there's too many settlements in the West Bank. Okay, except what does that matter? So what? You built a house in my country. Now you live in my country. I don't understand this whole idea that it'll be Swiss cheese, that the settlements would have to still belong to Israel. No, they knew what they were doing when they built the settlements in the West Bank. And if the West Bank is Palestine, guess what? Those settlements are now in Palestine. And the inhabitants of those settlements can make a decision on whether or not they want to immigrate back into Israel or if they want to be Jewish Palestinians, which, by the way, exists. The Palestinians have never given a mandate that Palestine is for Muslims. That is not a thing. They've never said it. It's not real. It doesn't even exist today. Palestine is filled with Christians. Palestine has even Jewish Palestinians. And of course, there's a majority Muslim population there. But Palestinians have never said Palestine is for Arab Muslims. That is not something they've ever said. That is something Israel says. Israel says Israel's a nation for the Jews. Palestine doesn't have that mandate. So if a settlement, a Jewish settlement, happens to be in the Palestinian borders, I don't understand why it can't be Palestine. And then those people have a choice. They can either go back to Israel and build homes in Israel and sell their homes to Palestinians, or they can stay and be Jewish Palestinians. It's not a big deal. They could do that. And they would have to then, desegregate the roads, because there's roads that are only for Jewish Israel or for Israeli only roads, not Jewish Israeli roads. They're roads for Israelis. You could be an Arab Israeli and ride on those roads as long as you're an Israeli or a Jerusalemite. And there is this, idea that, well, it's too late. There's too many settlements. I don't buy that crap. I think the settlements could just be in Palestine. And if the Jewish people that live there vacate those homes, then Palestinians can buy them. And then now they're Palestinian and Jewish neighborhood mixed, something like that. That to me is not an actual barrier to a two-state solution. I mean, look at like the United States, look at Texas. Texas was once Mexico. And then the United States captured Texas and it became America. And so the Mexicans that were living in Texas that were Mexicans suddenly became Mexican Americans. Okay, so I'm sure some of them left. I'm sure some of them said, well, crap, I don't really want to live under U.S. sovereignty, so I'm going to go deeper down into Mexico and I'm going to leave my house. I'm sure some of them did that. But as we know, many of them stayed in Texas and they just said, all right, then I guess we're Americans. So I don't see the issue with a two-state solution regarding the settlements. I understand that Israel tries to say, no, we want those settlements. But I think part of the problem is with the discussion about a two-state solution is the idea coming from the other side. So you have, of course, the Israelis who have gaslit you into believing that the settlements make it impossible. They say, well, we got these settlements and now they're Israel, they're part of Israel. And so, that only works if you buy it as an actual point. But if you say, so what? They built their homes in Palestine, so I guess they live in Palestine. If you just throw it back at them and say, that's not a barrier to a two-state solution, then it no longer is. It only is one because you've bought the narrative that the settlements have to be part of the state of Israel. No, they don't. No, they don't. If suddenly California gets annexed by Mexico, guess what? I live in Mexico. I don't live in Los Angeles of the United States of America that is surrounded by Mexico all around it. No, Los Angeles would just suddenly be Mexico. And I would have a choice to either leave or stay. So that, to me is not an actual barrier. But I'm definitely a firm believer in a two-state solution. Also, another narrative that has kind of gone around with this conflict, and I'm sure I'll talk more about this in the coming days because this is just such a big topic right now, but this notion that it's apartheid, it's not apartheid. It doesn't look like apartheid. It doesn't smell like apartheid. Even the recent ruling, the study that came out saying, oh, this is apartheid, from the Human Rights Watch, I believe, which is, by the way, not like the best organization on the planet. But anyway, they came out saying it's apartheid. Even they admitted when they claimed it was apartheid that it was different than other apartheids. So they actually redefined what apartheid meant in order to say this was an apartheid state. It's not an apartheid. It's a military occupation through and through. The Palestinian people are under military occupation. Their nation is under military occupation. And it has to end. The Israelis need to withdraw. They need to leave the Palestinians alone. They need to give them half of Jerusalem back. And they need to understand that the settlements are now in Palestine and that those settlements are under Palestinian law and Palestinian sovereignty. And those people should have a choice on whether or not they want to stay or go or sell their homes to Palestinians. So that is another kind of narrative that has been circulating around. Look, apartheid is different. That's a set of rules. That means one group lives by one rules and the other group lives by another. That's not actually what's going on in Palestine. They're living under military rules, which mean they change every day. It's not a set of laws because you're Palestinian. It's almost lawlessness. There are no laws. They don't know what the laws are each day because the law changes. Everything's under military order. So one day they wake up and suddenly they're not allowed to do something, and it's because the military just decided it. That's military occupation. That's different than apartheid. So, and it's different than apartheid because they aren't trying to merge together they're not in a segregated society. You got just a bunch of Israelis who have occupied and come into their area and controls everything in their area from water to air. They can't dig wells in their own backyard because they don't have permits. They don't have part of I believe the Oslo Accords was that they lost the authority over water, air, airspace, Wi-Fi, air type stuff. They lost all of the control, and you can't be a sovereign nation without all of that. And they need access to that back. They need to be able to control their airspace. They need to be able to control everything. But the Israelis don't want to do that because they know they pissed them off for so long that a lot of them want revenge. And it's not good. A lot of them do want revenge. And that is another sentiment to understand. The Palestinians are not all the innocent ones here. I talked to some really radical Palestinians when I was over there. Some that were like mind-blowingly radical. They want to get rid of Israel. They're very they should be gone. They don't belong here. I want to take it all, get rid of them, and we take all the land back. And I saw some extremely radical Israelis who were like, get rid of all the Palestinians. This is our land. You're not a real people. You get out of here. I mean, there are some really radical people on both sides of this situation. And there are some really violent people on both sides of this situation. There are Palestinians who attack and lynch Jewish citizens, and there are Jewish people that go and attack and lynch Palestinians. And it is really bad. It's not like one side is just totally victimized. There is violence coming at all sides of this. But one side does have all the authority and all of the power and all of the military might and the law and America and everything else on their side. And that imbalance in the fight makes it to where they are exerting dominance over these people and they are making their lives miserable. And it is absolutely against everything we believe when it comes to how war should operate and what happens after you win a war. But to them, the war isn't over, and they're doing all of these little things in order to gain more access to the land. They want the whole land. And they want the Arabs to move. They say, get out of here. There's enough Arab nations for you, and there's only little Israel for us. And so they say, get out, go. You've got Jordan, you have Lebanon, you have Syria, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Egypt, you have all these places you could go where you have a shared culture and a shared language. And we just got this little strip of land, and we just want it. And so, okay, I get that, but it's not going to work. So There needs to be some, serious, I think, no pun intended, come to Jesus moment on that.